When I opened the hotel room door and saw just one bed, my stomach twisted, not from modesty or even the awkwardness of sharing space. It was something deeper. Something I didn't want to name. I glanced behind me to see him walking down the hallway, rolling his broken suitcase, one while dragging and scraping loudly against the floor. He hadn't seen the room yet. I had just enough time to think of what I would say. There must be a mistake, maybe. Or I'll go talk to the receptionist. But I didn't say any of it. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the queen-sized bed in the center of the room. When he finally appeared at my side, his shoulder brushed mine lightly. He looked into the room, then looked at me, then smiled. A casual, easy smile. As if this meant nothing. As if we were nothing. But we weren't. Not really. And what happened that night wasn't planned. It wasn't something I fantasized about, or even wanted. Not at first. But when the door clicked shut behind us, and I heard the muffled silence of the hotel hallway vanish, I knew. I knew I had crossed the first invisible line. One of many. And you might think you know what happened next, but let me take you back to how it all really began. Before I tell you the truth I've kept buried for so long, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and be honest, have you ever been trapped in a situation that looked innocent from the outside, but you knew it wasn't? I didn't expect to feel so tired after the drive. It wasn't a long one, just under 4 hours, but somehow it left me feeling like I'd aged another decade. My husband had insisted on making the arrangements for this trip, which meant, of course, that things were done last minute, scattered, and, in this case, incorrectly. The hotel was a modest mountain lodge with wooden beams, creaky floors, and a soft pine scent in the air that reminded me of holidays long gone. I should have been excited. I should have felt something like joy at the idea of spending time with family again. Instead, I felt unease sitting heavy in my chest, like a coat I couldn't take off. We arrived just before sunset. My husband had already darted off to check us in, barking something over his shoulder about reception desks and confirmation numbers. I was left standing next to the car, watching the sky fade from gold to ash. My stepson, or more accurately, my husband's son from his first marriage, stood next to me, silent. He was older now, of course. We hadn't seen each other in years. Not since the last family event where we exchanged polite smiles and avoided any real conversation. Back then, he was awkward and quiet, still growing into his bones. But the man standing next to me now was different. Taller. More self-assured. There was something about his presence that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put a name to it. When my husband returned, he looked annoyed. "There's been a mix-up," he said, without apology. "They only have 2 rooms. One for the parents, and one for the kids." I blinked. The kids? He was already walking back toward the entrance. "Figure it out. I'll call the travel agent." And just like that, I was left to figure it out. The room itself was nothing extraordinary. Basic. Clean. A single queen-sized bed, a small window overlooking the woods, a narrow bathroom, and one lamp that flickered if you touched it wrong. I stood at the foot of the bed, trying to calculate whether I should sleep on the floor or try to get another room. By the time he rolled in his suitcase, dragging it like an injured animal, I still hadn't decided. He dropped the handle, looked around, and smirked. "One bed, huh?" I folded my arms. "I'll talk to reception." He shrugged. "Don't bother. They said they're fully booked." I checked. I hadn't noticed him slipping away. I didn't even know he had spoken to anyone. He moved easily around the room, like it already belonged to him. He tossed his jacket on the back of the chair, opened the window slightly, and then sat on the edge of the bed, stretching his legs. I stayed by the door. Something about the casualness of it all irritated me. "I'll sleep on the floor," I said flatly. He looked up. "Why? It's just a bed." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" I didn't answer. I just opened my suitcase and started unpacking. Dinner was quiet. My husband sat with his parents, chatting about the property market like it was the most fascinating thing on earth. I picked at my food, sipped my wine, and forced smiles at all the right moments. Across the table, my roommate for the weekend was completely relaxed, laughing at their jokes, holding his glass just loosely enough to seem charming. When we returned to the room, the tension returned with us. I changed in the bathroom, taking longer than I needed to, brushing my hair unnecessarily, examining my reflection under unfamiliar lighting. I didn't like what I saw, new lines around my mouth, tiredness beneath my eyes. When I came out, he was already under the blanket, shirtless, his phone in hand. "I'll sleep over the covers," he offered, not looking up. "You can take the blanket." "Fine." I slipped in beside him, fully clothed, as far to the edge as I could manage. He turned off the light, and the room filled with the soft hum of crickets through the open window. But I couldn't sleep. Not because of the bed, or the room, or even his presence. Because of the silence. And the memories it brought with it. We hadn't grown up together. We'd met when I was already married. Our connection had always been civil, shallow, skimming the surface. But something about being forced into this closeness unearthed things I didn't expect to feel. I turned away from him, staring at the wall. His breathing was steady. He was already asleep. And I told myself, this was just one night. One bed. No story. I closed my eyes and waited for morning. The following morning came with a heaviness that clung to my skin like damp linen. I woke before dawn, the room still cloaked in gray-blue shadows, the thin hotel curtain doing little to keep the world out. I lay there for a few minutes, not moving, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me. It was calm. Measured. As if the awkwardness of the night before had meant nothing to him. As if we were simply two people sharing space out of necessity. I slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb him, and padded barefoot into the bathroom. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. My hair, tousled from restless sleep, framed a face too serious for this early hour. There were faint creases on my cheek from the pillow, but deeper still were the ones that didn't fade when I blinked or smiled. I rinsed my face, hoping the cold water would wash away more than just fatigue. Back in the room, I found my suitcase and pulled out the safest outfit I had packed, a long-sleeved blouse and a loose pair of jeans. Nothing form-fitting, nothing inviting. I dressed in silence, moving like a shadow, and by the time he stirred, I was seated in the corner chair, scrolling absently through emails on my phone. He sat up slowly, stretching with the ease of someone who didn't feel out of place. I pretended not to notice. "Morning," he said. His voice was hoarse with sleep. I nodded but didn't look up. I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. Downstairs, the rest of the family had already gathered for breakfast. My husband waved us over with one hand, his other still holding his phone. He was mid-call, something about supplier delays, documents, numbers I didn't care to hear. I took a seat beside him, offering a tight smile to my in-laws, and quietly poured myself coffee. He took the seat across from me, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something about the room, about the sleeping arrangement. But he didn't. He buttered a slice of toast, asked someone to pass the jam, and joined in the casual morning chatter like nothing had happened. I kept my eyes on my plate. The clinking of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, it all blurred into a dull background hum. Until I heard him say something. She used to win every school art contest. First place every time. I looked up sharply. He was talking about me. There was a small, amused smile on his face, but his eyes were steady, watching me. My cheeks flushed. That was a long time ago, I said, too quickly. My husband glanced up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. You never told me that. I shrugged. It wasn't important. But it had been, once. After breakfast, the family decided to explore the nearby town. I offered to stay back, claiming a mild headache. No one questioned it. My husband barely acknowledged my words before returning to his call. He, however, hesitated. I can stay too, if you want company. I shook my head. I'll be fine. But he stayed anyway. We walked slowly down a wooded trail behind the hotel, away from the others, away from the buzz of people and plans. The leaves crunched beneath our feet, the air carried the faint scent of pine and damp soil. I kept a careful distance, my arms crossed, eyes on the path. You really were talented, he said after a while. I remember your paintings. They were always full of color. I haven't painted in years. Why not? I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to say that somewhere along the way, I had stopped doing things for myself. That every ounce of energy went into work, or errands, or making sure everyone else had what they needed. That the person who once stayed up late sketching by lamplight had slowly dissolved into someone who forgot what her own voice sounded like. I just don't anymore, I finally said. He didn't press. As we turned a bend in the trail, the hotel came back into view. I felt a sudden pang of disappointment. The quiet of the woods, the absence of expectation, it had been a relief. When we reached the room again, he unlocked the door and held it open for me. I stepped inside, the still air greeting me like a forgotten thought. He stood behind me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? Being close to someone for so long and not knowing anything about them." I turned around slowly. We're not close. He looked at me with something unreadable in his expression. No, he said. But maybe we could have been. It was foolish, the way my heart stumbled over itself in that moment. I stepped past him toward the window, needing space, needing to see sky. But before I could say anything else, I heard his footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't move. And then, we kissed. It lasted just a moment. A second too long. A breath too deep. A silence too full. When it ended, I pulled away, retreating like someone burned. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation, for regret, for laughter. But he gave me none of those. Just a long, steady look before stepping back and sitting down on the edge of the bed. I went into the bathroom. Closed the door. Locked it. Inside, I gripped the edges of the sink and stared at myself again. The same reflection. The same tired eyes. But this time, they held something else. A question I wasn't ready to answer. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of the room beyond, wondering if this was the first thread unraveling, or the last one I had left. The bathroom became my sanctuary that day. I stood there far longer than necessary, long after the sound of his footsteps had faded into silence, long after the quiet ticking of the hotel room clock became unbearable. I wasn't hiding from him, I was hiding from myself. From the thoughts that had begun to slither into my mind, unwelcome and uninvited. They pressed behind my eyes like a second heartbeat, one I couldn't ignore. When I finally stepped out, the room was empty. His suitcase was still in the corner, his shoes by the chair, but he was gone. I breathed out slowly, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. The window was cracked open again. Cool air moved gently through the room, stirring the curtain like a whisper. I sat down on the edge of the bed, pressing my fingers into the mattress as if it might answer something. But it didn't. Nothing did. The day passed in fragments. Breakfast again, though I barely touched my food. A walk with my husband, who spent more time on calls than in conversation. He mentioned a contract falling through, an unexpected delay, something about flights and reschedules. I nodded in all the right places, gave the appropriate responses, but I wasn't really there. My thoughts stayed locked in that room, in that silence, in the space between intention and accident. Later, we joined the rest of the family for an afternoon outing, a local winery known for its rustic charm. The drive took longer than expected, winding through hills and sharp turns. The car was too warm. My blouse clung to my back, and I rolled the window down halfway to let in the breeze. He sat behind me, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air when he moved. I kept my gaze trained on the passing trees. At the winery, laughter flowed freely. My in-laws sipped wine and swapped stories from their youth. My husband stayed close to the manager, discussing shipping rates and taxes with the kind of enthusiasm he rarely showed me anymore. I excused myself to walk through the vineyard alone. Rows of vines stretched endlessly in every direction, neat and repetitive. The soil beneath my feet was soft. The sky was wide and clear, but I felt the weight of something looming just behind my ribs. He found me standing between two rows, staring at the horizon like it held answers. "Needed air?" he asked, voice quiet. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't find the words. "I shouldn't have," he added after a pause. That was all he said. Not an apology, not a justification, just that. And it hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cold, but because it wasn't. It was careful. Thoughtful. And real. "I know," I said. The silence between us deepened, filled with everything we weren't saying. He turned and walked away before it could break us any further. Back at the hotel, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I changed into a sweater, even though the room wasn't cold. I needed the weight of it, something to anchor me. That evening, we gathered again for dinner. A small restaurant tucked in the corner of the lodge, candles on each table, soft instrumental music playing overhead. My husband took my hand briefly before sitting down. A gesture that once might have comforted me now felt unfamiliar, like trying to remember a dream. He asked how my day had been. I told him it was fine. I told him the winery was lovely. I told him the vines were beautiful. I didn't tell him about the silence. Or the confession. After the meal, most of the family lingered at the bar, ordering nightcaps. I declined. I wanted nothing more than to return to the room and forget the weight in my chest. He was already there when I arrived. Sitting on the balcony, a glass of water in hand, legs stretched out, head tilted toward the night sky. He didn't acknowledge me at first, and I wasn't sure if I was grateful or hurt. I stepped inside quietly, began my usual routine, washing my face, brushing my teeth, laying out clothes for the next morning. Everything mechanical, everything routine. Finally, I moved toward the balcony. I didn't plan to speak. I only wanted to feel the air. But he turned to look at me. "You okay?" he asked. I almost said yes. But I didn't. "I don't know," I answered. He nodded, like he understood that more than I expected. Then, softly, "I shouldn't have kissed you." My heart tightened. But I don't regret it. That made it worse. Not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. I looked out at the forest below, dark shapes pressed against darker shadows. Somewhere, an owl called out. "You make me feel seen," I said, surprising myself. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. And I don't know what to do with that. He set his glass down gently. Maybe you don't have to do anything, he said. But I did. Because every moment like this chipped away at a foundation I had spent years building. I stepped back into the room, closed the balcony door, and turned off the lights. Crawled into bed, pulled the blanket around me. He remained outside for a long time. When he finally came in, he lay as far from me as he could. We didn't speak. But we didn't sleep either. The air between us was too loud with things unsaid. The next morning brought a kind of silence I hadn't known before. Not the usual tired, shared quiet between people who'd run out of small talk, nor the heavy hush of an argument left unresolved. This was something else, a tension built from restraint, from the growing awareness that words, if spoken, might tear through the fragile wall we had both started building between us. He was already awake when I opened my eyes. He sat on the balcony again, the door cracked open just enough for the morning breeze to slip through. I didn't move at first. I watched his silhouette framed against the rising sun, and for a brief second, I wondered what he was thinking. If he felt what I felt. Or if he'd pushed it aside with the kind of ease I never quite mastered. I moved slowly, gathering my things for the shower, taking more time than needed. My husband had texted me sometime around midnight, meeting with supplier in town. Back late tomorrow. I stared at the message, rereading it twice, as if hoping it would change. It didn't. His absence stretched out ahead of me like a permission I never asked for and didn't know what to do with. After getting ready, I left the room. I didn't speak to him. He didn't ask where I was going. It wasn't anger. It was preservation. The hotel lobby was quiet. I passed a few guests sipping coffee and reading newspapers, their voices hushed and polite. Outside, the air was crisp, filled with pine and dew and the faint scent of firewood. I walked aimlessly, letting my feet lead. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. The forest trail just behind the lodge beckoned like a memory I hadn't lived yet. By the time I reached the bend in the path where the trees opened into a small clearing, I realized I hadn't thought about where I was going. I just needed not to be inside that room. Not to be beside him. Not yet. I sat on a flat stone half covered in moss. The trees whispered overhead. I let my eyes close. Let my breath slow. A voice interrupted the quiet. You always used to sneak away like this. I opened my eyes. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. I didn't ask how he'd found me. I didn't need to. I didn't sneak, I said. I drifted. He sat on another stone across from me. The space between us wasn't wide, but it felt measured. Intentional. I used to think you were just avoiding people, he said. But I think now you were just looking for something quieter than everyone else. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. The sun filtered through the trees, slicing golden beams across his face. He looked older than yesterday. Or maybe I was just seeing him differently. We sat like that for a long while. Not speaking. Not moving. Just existing in the same moment, knowing that any wrong word could shift the ground beneath us. Eventually, I stood. Brushed off my jeans. He followed without question, falling into step beside me as we walked back to the hotel. When we reached the main building, the rest of the family was gathered on the back patio. Someone had planned a barbecue. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven circles. Laughter floated up toward us before we even turned the corner. He veered left toward them. I veered right. In the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, hands in my lap, staring at the framed print on the wall. A watercolor landscape, soft and inoffensive. It looked like the kind of thing someone painted to sell to hotels. Pretty, forgettable, safe. I wondered if that was how I looked to other people. Like someone who had made herself into the most acceptable version of herself. Soft edges. Safe colors. Clean lines. But inside, I felt jagged. Later that afternoon, I joined the family out of obligation. I laughed at stories, filled plates, offered seconds, nodded at all the right moments. I smiled at my husband's father when he complimented the salad I hadn't made. I complimented my sister-in-law's earrings. I helped clear the table. He sat across the yard from me, talking with one of the cousins. We didn't look at each other. But I felt him. The way you feel the sun behind a cloud, present, even when hidden. That evening, the power flickered. A storm was coming. The forecast had promised nothing more than light rain, but the sky had its own agenda. The clouds rolled in thick and gray, and by the time dinner ended, wind was shaking the branches outside. Back in the room, I pulled the curtains closed and lit one of the small battery-powered lanterns the hotel had provided. The room glowed in a soft amber light. He came in quietly, brushing raindrops from his shoulders. His hair was damp and his shirt clung to him in places. He didn't speak. I handed him a towel. He nodded his thanks. We moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps but not the rhythm. I took the left side of the bed again. He took the right. The storm rattled the windows, thunder rolling gently in the distance. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, every breath measured. I heard him shift. Then stillness. Then breath. And then. I don't want to make this harder for you. I closed my eyes. I didn't answer. I don't want to disappear again without saying that. I opened my mouth. Closed it. My chest ached. I didn't ask for this, I whispered. Whatever this is. I know. Another pause. But I don't want to pretend it didn't happen either. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, silence settled between us again. But this silence was different. Not empty. Full. Pulled taut between the past and the present. Between what we were allowed to feel and what we actually did. I didn't move closer. Neither did he. But neither of us turned away. The rain continued through the night, a steady rhythm against the windows like an old song I didn't know the words to anymore. I lay still for a long time, listening, thinking, breathing. My thoughts moved in slow, tired circles, guilt edged with desire, confusion tangled with clarity. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is the soft light of morning filtering through the curtains. The storm had passed. The room was quiet. He was still asleep, turned toward the wall, his breathing deep and even. For a moment, I watched him. Not out of longing or curiosity, but out of disbelief. At myself. At the version of me who'd let things reach this point. I dressed quickly, without turning on the lights. I didn't want to wake him. Or maybe I didn't want to face him. I told myself I needed air, clarity, distance. What I really needed was to feel like I still had some control. Downstairs, the hotel breakfast room was mostly empty. The smell of toast and brewed coffee filled the space. I took a seat by the window and wrapped my hands around a ceramic mug, the warmth grounding me. Outside, the world was wet and glistening. Trees dripping. Puddles scattered like mirrors across the gravel path. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from my husband. Heading back this evening. How are things? I stared at the words. Simple. Routine. Familiar. But they felt like a test. Like a thread tied tightly around everything I'd managed to keep from unraveling. I didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, I turned my gaze toward the woods behind the hotel, the path we had walked together not so long ago. I remembered how quiet it had been. How, for once, I had felt truly present. Not as a wife. Not as a mother. Not as someone constantly trying to manage or fix or soothe. Just a woman, existing in her own skin, in her own silence. When I finally returned to the room, it was empty. His side of the bed was unmade, the sheets still rumpled from sleep. His jacket was gone. His shoes, too. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Later that morning, the family had plans to drive to a nearby town, explore the local shops and cafes. I offered to stay back again. Blamed a headache. No one argued. My husband's mother gave me a pill from her purse. My sister-in-law offered ginger tea. Everyone else moved around me like I was a piece of furniture. He came back just as they were leaving. Our eyes met for a brief second. No words. Just a nod, the kind you give someone across a crowded room when there's too much to say and no space to say it. He didn't follow them. He stayed. The room felt smaller than before. Maybe because we both knew what couldn't be unsaid anymore. We moved around each other slowly, cautiously. I folded laundry. He cleaned out his bag. We didn't touch. We barely spoke. The tension wasn't explosive. It wasn't even bitter. It was tender, and that made it harder. Sometime after lunch, he stood by the window, watching the sky shift between clouds. I sat on the bed, a book in my lap I hadn't touched in over an hour. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice soft. I looked up. "I didn't come here with intentions. This just happened." I closed the book. "I know." A pause hung in the air like fog. "It won't happen again," he added. I nodded. But we both knew we were lying. That evening, the family returned, cheerful and sun-kissed, full of stories and bags of souvenirs. My husband found me in the room, bent over my suitcase, folding shirts I hadn't worn. He kissed my cheek, asked if I was feeling better. I said yes. We had dinner as a group in the main lodge, seated at a long wooden table. Wine was passed. Jokes were made. Old family stories recycled like heirlooms. He sat directly across from me. We didn't look at each other, not really. But I was aware of him the entire time. Where his hands rested. When he reached for the salt. When he laughed. After dessert, my husband took my hand under the table. His fingers brushed mine gently, the way they used to when we were dating. I smiled at him, reflexively, not entirely sure why. Later, back in our room, I found myself in the bathroom again. The mirror hadn't changed. But I had. I brushed my hair slowly, deliberately. I didn't want to be beautiful. I didn't want to be desired. I just wanted to be understood. And I realized, perhaps for the first time, that I hadn't felt that in a very long time. When I stepped out, he was already in bed. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I turned off the light. Crawled under the blanket. Closed my eyes. We didn't speak. But we kissed. And the room exhaled with us. The air the next morning felt heavier, not in temperature but in meaning. I woke early again, stirred not by noise or light but by a restlessness inside me that hadn't let me sleep more than a few hours. The bed beside me was empty. He had already gone. I stared at the ceiling for a while, waiting for my heartbeat to settle, for the feelings to return to their corners, but they didn't. They stayed just beneath the surface, loud and unwelcome. I moved slowly through the motions of getting ready, brushing my teeth, smoothing the wrinkles in my clothes, tying back my hair with a practiced efficiency that didn't require thought. It helped to keep moving, even if I wasn't going anywhere. When I stepped outside, the hallway was still and dim, the kind of quiet reserved for early hours before the world remembers to wake. I walked toward the dining area more out of habit than hunger. My body didn't crave food, but something about sitting alone with a cup of coffee had started to feel necessary, like grounding myself before the day began. He was already there. Seated at the far end of the room by the large window, coffee in hand, unread newspaper spread in front of him like a prop. He glanced up when he saw me, but didn't smile. I didn't either. It was too early for pretending. I took a seat 2 tables away. Not close enough to speak. Not far enough to ignore. Outside, the clouds were low and slow-moving, their bellies gray with weight. I watched a pair of birds hop along the gravel path, pecking at nothing, moving in unison. My coffee grew cold in my hands. Eventually, he stood. Walked past me without speaking. I didn't look up, but I heard his footsteps, steady, unhurried, and I wondered if it was guilt that made him quiet, or self-preservation. The rest of the day unfolded in pieces. A scheduled family hike was cancelled due to the drizzle that had started around noon. Some chose to stay in and read, others drove into town to browse antique stores. I declined both options and instead wandered the property alone, umbrella in hand, shoes damp from the wet grass. I found myself back on the trail behind the hotel, where the trees offered a gentle shield from the drizzle. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to everything, and the forest felt more alive than ever, the kind of silence that listens rather than speaks. I sat on a damp bench, pulled my jacket tighter, and let the weight of the last few days rest fully on my chest. The ache wasn't sharp. It was slow, dull, like the pain of something you've carried too long without realizing. For years, I had moved through my days with practiced grace. I had been dependable, composed, responsible. The kind of woman who never missed an appointment, never raised her voice in public, never forgot a birthday. I had worn my steadiness like armor, convinced it would protect me from dissatisfaction, from longing. But it hadn't. All it had done was bury the parts of me that once felt vibrant. Alive. And now, with one look, one moment, someone had found those parts again. Not by force. Not even by intention. Just by being there. Just by seeing me. It should have frightened me more than it did. When I returned to the hotel, the lobby was buzzing with family. Someone was playing cards near the fireplace. My sister-in-law was sharing pictures on her phone. My husband's father laughed at a story I didn't hear. I walked through them like a ghost, smiling politely when someone noticed me, nodding, but not lingering. In the room, he wasn't there. I exhaled in relief, though it felt hollow. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed painting on the wall again. The same soft landscape. Still forgettable. I didn't hear him come in. I only noticed when I felt the air shift. He closed the door quietly behind him, moved to the far side of the room without speaking. He placed something on the desk, a bag, maybe, or a book. I didn't turn to look. For a while, we existed in parallel silence. The kind that fills a room like smoke. Then, without preamble, he spoke. "You used to be louder," he said. "Not with your voice. But with everything else." I turned to face him slowly. "In the way you walked," he continued. "The way you laughed. You used to take up space." His words weren't cruel. They weren't even nostalgic. Just observant. "I didn't mean to change," I said. He nodded. "I know." That was the problem. He did know. He saw the difference. And so did I. That night, the family had a fire pit gathering scheduled. Blankets and marshmallows and stories meant to knit people together in soft, warm memories. I stood near the edge of the group, holding a mug of tea I didn't drink. My husband had finally returned. He stood on the other side of the fire, laughing, his arm draped around his sister's shoulder, unaware that anything had changed. When it was time to go back inside, he took my hand again. Held it loosely as we walked the gravel path. I said nothing. Neither did he. In the room, I showered first. The water wasn't hot enough, or maybe I had stayed in too long and grown used to it. When I stepped out, the mirror was fogged. I wiped a circle and stared into it. My face looked pale. Tired. But not broken. He was already under the covers when I returned. Reading something on his phone. I changed in the dark, climbed in beside him, and turned toward the wall. He didn't say goodnight. Neither did I. But we both stayed awake. Listening to the same quiet. Feeling the same weight. And we spent the night together. The next morning, I didn't open my eyes right away. I let the stillness linger, allowed myself to stay suspended in that fragile in-between where nothing was decided, and time hadn't yet caught up to consequences. The bed was warm, the air cool. A sliver of sunlight slipped between the curtains and rested across the blanket near my hip. I didn't reach for it. I didn't move. But eventually, I had to. I rolled onto my back slowly. The room was quiet. He wasn't there. I sat up, and for a moment, just sat with the silence. No sound from the hallway, no murmurs of the family downstairs, no footsteps, no movement. My body ached, not from sleep, but from the weight of too many thoughts pressed into too small a space. I rose, dressed, folded the blanket at the edge of the bed as if returning it to order might return something in me as well. It didn't. When I stepped out into the hallway, the scent of fresh coffee met me first, followed by the low clinking of dishes and the muffled sound of someone laughing, my sister-in-law, probably. She had the kind of laugh that filled every space, even the ones not meant for it. I made my way down to the lounge where the family had gathered around the long breakfast table. Most of the seats were taken, but one near the window remained empty. I slid into it quietly, offering nods to the people around me, keeping my smile small and polite. He was at the opposite end of the table, 2 chairs down from my husband, his face partially hidden behind a raised mug. He didn't look at me, and I didn't expect him to. Still, I felt the tension between us like a cord stretched just out of sight, humming beneath the table. My husband was animated this morning. He recounted stories from his late-night trip into town, gesturing with his hands, mimicking accents, making the cousins laugh. He squeezed my hand once under the table. I smiled on cue, leaned into his shoulder briefly, and listened without really hearing. After breakfast, plans were made for a final hike before we would all start packing for departure the next day. A short trail through the forest that circled back toward the far side of the property. My husband was excited, eager to stretch his legs and breathe in real air after being stuck in cars and meetings. I agreed to come, despite myself. The trail was damp but manageable, the sun having pushed most of the moisture from the ground. We walked in staggered groups, pairs and trios spread across the path. I walked beside my husband for a while, letting him talk about a podcast he'd listened to, nodding when appropriate. My eyes wandered toward the trees more than once, searching for nothing in particular. Behind us, he walked quietly, sometimes alone, sometimes near one of the cousins. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't look toward me. But I felt him. The way you feel someone standing behind you even when you can't see them. Halfway through the trail, the group paused at a small wooden lookout point. It was nothing elaborate, a few benches, a plaque with a brief history of the forest, a railing overlooking a slope scattered with pine. People took turns taking photos, stretching, sipping water from thermoses. My husband wandered toward the plaque with one of his brothers. I took a step away from the group. Just a few feet. Far enough to feel the difference in quiet. That's when I saw him approach. No words, no movement that could be called deliberate. Just proximity. We stood there, side by side, not touching, not speaking. The wind rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. Below us, the slope dipped into a small ravine choked with ferns and undergrowth. I don't know how to feel, I said, not looking at him. I think you do, he replied. I closed my eyes. Then I don't know what to do with it. That makes two of us. We fell silent again. Not out of discomfort, but out of the knowledge that there was nothing simple left to say. The moment was full. Heavy. Honest. When we returned to the group, no one noticed our absence. Or if they did, they didn't mention it. Back at the hotel, people began packing, organizing cars, checking itineraries. My husband called the front desk to confirm checkout times, chatted about traffic and toll roads, made a joke about never booking group trips again. I sat on the edge of the bed, folding a sweater, smoothing invisible wrinkles, my hands steady. Evening came too fast. A final dinner was arranged at a nearby restaurant. Tables were pushed together. Toasts were made. Laughter filled every space. He didn't come. Someone said he had a headache. I didn't ask. My husband's arm was around me most of the meal. Not tightly, not possessively, just there, a constant warmth, a reassurance. He kissed my temple at one point, whispered that this trip had been good for us. I nodded. Said I agreed. When we returned to the hotel, the night air was colder than I expected. I shivered slightly. My husband offered his jacket. I declined. In the room, he showered first. I sat by the window, watching the forest dissolve into darkness. He emerged in a towel, drying his hair, humming a tune I didn't recognize. He looked relaxed. Content. And I envied him for it. Later, when the lights were out and the room was still, I stared at the ceiling again. My thoughts moved slower now. Not because they were gone, but because they were growing tired. Like me. He stirred beside me. Reached for my hand. Held it. I didn't pull away. But I didn't hold back either. The silence between us was no longer sharp. Just wide. I didn't sleep. Neither did he. And we both knew why. Departure morning arrived wrapped in fog. It clung low to the ground, blurring the outlines of trees and softening the edges of the gravel paths that crunched beneath rolling suitcases and early footsteps. I stood by the window with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, watching as bags were loaded into trunks and people moved with that quiet urgency unique to the last day of a trip. Conversations were hushed, interrupted by the zip of luggage and the beep of car locks. Inside the room, my husband was double-checking drawers and making sure nothing had been left behind. His movements were efficient, purposeful. He didn't say much, and I didn't ask why. We'd settled into a rhythm over the years, the kind that didn't need constant narration. I knew what he was doing. He knew I wasn't in the mood for chatter. I'd already packed the night before. My bag sat by the door, zipped tight, like a sealed thought I didn't want to reopen. He finished his sweep of the room and straightened up, stretching his back with a quiet sigh. He glanced at me, then out the window. They say the fog will lift by the time we hit the highway, he said. I nodded, but didn't look at him. He paused, then added, "It's been a good trip, hasn't it?" That question sat in the air like a loose thread. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure how to. Eventually, I said, "It's been something." He smiled, either missing my hesitation or choosing to ignore it. "We should do this more often." I watched a bird land on the roof of a parked SUV. It hopped twice, then flew away. Outside, the family had started gathering by the cars. My sister-in-law waved at us through the window. I raised a hand in return, more out of instinct than enthusiasm. He picked up our bags and opened the door. I followed him out, leaving behind the room that had held more than either of us realized. More than we'd ever speak of. Downstairs, goodbyes were being exchanged. Hugs. Plans to call. Promises of reunions that may or may not happen. I saw him near the far end of the lot, helping someone tie down luggage with bungee cords. His sleeves were rolled up, and his head was slightly tilted as he focused on the task. He hadn't noticed me yet. I felt my husband's hand press gently against my back, guiding me toward the car. His voice was soft in my ear. "I'll warm it up." I nodded, letting him go ahead. For a moment, I stood alone, watching the fog shift and swirl around the trees like breath on glass. He looked up. Our eyes met. There was no smile. No nod. Just a recognition that passed between us like a shadow over water, visible, but untouchable. My husband called to me from the driver's side. I turned. Walked toward the car. Got in. The engine started. The heater hummed softly. He adjusted the mirror, checked his blind spot. I stared out the window. As we pulled away, I glanced back once. He was still standing there, one hand resting on the roof of the car he'd been helping with. Still watching. The fog swallowed the rest. The drive was quiet. My husband played a podcast, something about history, I think, but I didn't listen. I watched the trees blur past, the lines in the road stretching endlessly forward. I felt neither relief nor regret. Just the dull echo of something that had already happened and couldn't be undone. Hours later, home wrapped around me like a too familiar coat. I walked through the rooms, touching nothing, letting the silence settle back into its usual places. The kitchen was clean. The living room unchanged. Our bed, made exactly as we'd left it. I stood in the doorway for a while before entering. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, who drifted off easily, breathing deep and steady. I stared at the ceiling, just as I had in that hotel room, feeling the weight of something I didn't know how to carry but couldn't seem to set down. Around midnight, I rose and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The floor was cold beneath my feet. I poured a glass of water and stood at the sink, staring into the dark backyard, where the moon cast faint silver lines across the grass. My phone buzzed on the counter. I stared at the screen. No name. Just a number I hadn't saved. But I knew who it was. The message was short. Got back okay. Hope you're all right. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it either. I set the phone down and returned to bed. The sheets were still warm. My husband stirred slightly as I climbed in beside him, one arm moving instinctively to rest across my waist. I closed my eyes. I dreamed of nothing. Only fog. Time passed differently after we returned home. Not faster or slower, just heavier. Days felt long, but moments flickered past like sparks. I moved through the house like someone trying to memorize it again, touching surfaces, adjusting framed photos, watering plants that had already been watered. Everything looked the same, but I felt changed in a way I couldn't yet explain. Not broken. Not better. Just different. My husband slipped easily back into routine. He had meetings lined up the day after we returned, conference calls, travel plans, spreadsheets he never let me see but always insisted were a nightmare. He left early, returned late, and seemed satisfied with the rhythm of normal life reasserting itself. I pretended to match his ease. I cooked, I answered emails, I went to the store. I smiled when I had to. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just existed in quiet parallel to my own choices. The message stayed in my phone. I read it 3 times the day it came, once the next morning, and again a week later. I never responded. But I didn't block the number either. A part of me thought he would write again. Another part of me hoped he wouldn't. The silence between us had become a kind of understanding, a space we both chose to keep untouched. Some nights, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, just like I had in that hotel bed, listening to my husband's steady breathing, measuring the seconds between thoughts. On those nights, I remembered everything too clearly, the forest path, the sound of his voice, the way my heart raced for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. I wondered how something so quiet could echo so loudly inside me. The days piled up. I started going for long walks around the neighborhood. At first, I just wandered without purpose, pretending to admire flowers in other people's gardens, pretending I was thinking about dinner or chores. But really, I walked because stillness made the noise in my head too loud. One afternoon, I passed a park I hadn't visited in years. There was a wooden bench under a sycamore tree near the edge of a small pond. I used to sit there when the kids were young, when life was filled with a different kind of urgency. Now the bench looked smaller, the tree older. I sat anyway. A boy rode past on a bike, his helmet slightly crooked, his mother jogging behind him. A couple nearby was feeding ducks, their laughter soft and warm. The world was still turning, full of ordinary, beautiful moments. And I felt like I was standing behind a glass wall watching it all. I stayed until the sky turned orange, then made my way home in silence. That night, I didn't speak much at dinner. My husband told me about a client who had backed out of a deal at the last minute, how frustrating it had been, how he'd salvaged the contract. I nodded, smiled when I should. He didn't notice my quiet. Or maybe he was grateful for it. In bed, I lay facing away from him. The space between us felt colder now, not from anger, but from something more permanent. The quiet kind of distance that settles in when two people stop asking questions. The next morning, I woke to find his side of the bed empty. I heard the shower running. I sat up, looked around the room, then reached for my phone. A new message. Are you okay? Just 3 words. Not dramatic. Not desperate. Just careful. Gentle. I held the phone for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, unsure what a reply would even mean. What truth could I possibly give that wouldn't unravel something? Eventually, I typed, yes. Then deleted it. Typed again, I don't know. Deleted that too. In the end, I just locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. Later that day, I received a call from my sister-in-law. She wanted to know if we were coming to her birthday next week. I told her I'd check our schedule. She laughed, said she assumed we'd be there anyway. You two are always the most put-together couple, she said. The rest of us are barely surviving. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say, put together is just a nicer word for quiet. But I didn't. I said we'd see them soon. After the call, I walked into the kitchen and opened the back door. The sunlight was warm on my face. The garden was overgrown. I hadn't touched it since spring. I grabbed gloves from the shed and started pulling weeds, my hands moving without instruction. I worked until my fingers ached, until sweat dampened my shirt, until the ache in my arms felt more real than the one in my chest. When I finally sat down on the back steps, I felt the kind of exhaustion that was earned. Not emotional. Just physical. And it helped, if only for a while. Inside, I made tea and sat by the window. The phone buzzed again. No words this time. Just a photo of the forest trail from the lodge. The same clearing. The bench. The trees. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I deleted the photo. But not the thread. That evening, I told my husband I was going to sleep early. He stayed in the living room, watching a documentary, the soft hum of narration drifting down the hallway as I brushed my teeth and changed into an old t-shirt. In bed, I lay still. Eyes closed. Breathing slow. Listening to the house settle. I didn't think about the forest. I didn't think about the room. I didn't think about the photo. But I didn't sleep either. And that, somehow, felt like a kind of choice. The morning after the photo arrived, I woke with the distinct sense that something inside me had shifted. It wasn't clarity. Not exactly. More like the quiet realization that I couldn't keep hovering in the space between what had happened and what I pretended hadn't. I'd been suspended for weeks, keeping everything just beneath the surface, hoping time would soften it all into insignificance. But it hadn't. And it wouldn't. I moved through the day as I always did. Made the bed. Brewed coffee. Answered work emails. Returned a call to a neighbor about a local charity event. Everything neat, tidy, accounted for. But underneath it all, a thread had begun to pull loose, small and quiet but insistent. That afternoon, I opened the drawer where I kept old notebooks, recipes, grocery lists, snippets of thoughts I never finished. In the very back, beneath a stack of unused birthday cards, I found my sketchpad. I hadn't touched it in years. The first few pages were smudged, faded. A child's face. A window. A set of bare feet under a table. I flipped through them slowly, feeling like I was looking at someone else's life. Then I turned to a blank page. I didn't think. I just began. Lines formed. Not graceful or practiced, but honest. My hand moved on its own, muscle memory buried beneath years of silence. Shapes emerged. A bench. A path. Trees rising in soft repetition. Nothing dramatic. Just the forest. Just what I remembered. I didn't finish it. I didn't need to. That night, my husband suggested we open a bottle of wine. It had been sitting in the cabinet since our anniversary 2 years ago, unopened, waiting for a reason. He lit candles, set out 2 glasses, dimmed the kitchen lights. He wanted to talk, he said. Just the 2 of us. So we sat. He poured. I sipped. He told me about a new business proposal, a colleague retiring, something about real estate prices. I nodded in the right places, smiled when he made a dry joke. It was familiar. Almost comforting. Then his tone changed. You've been quiet lately, he said. Since the trip. I looked down at the wine in my glass, then up at him. His eyes searched mine, not suspicious, not angry. Just searching. I've had a lot on my mind, I said. He waited. I've been thinking about who I used to be. What I let go of. I didn't mean it to sound so rehearsed, but it came out like a line I'd practiced too many times. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass absently. You've always carried so much, he said. I don't think I ever told you that I see it. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were profound, but because they were unexpected. I guess I stopped asking to be seen, I said. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was fragile. Eventually, we cleared the dishes together. He kissed my cheek before heading upstairs. I stood in the kitchen a while longer, staring out the window into the dark. When I joined him in bed, he was already asleep. I didn't sleep right away. Instead, I reached for my phone. No new messages. I opened the thread anyway. Scrolled through the short exchange. Just 2 messages. Both brief. Both unfinished. And then, without overthinking it, I typed. I remember the silence more than anything else. I hit send. Then turned off the phone. The next morning, the message was marked as read, but there was no reply. And that, somehow, felt right. The week passed. I started painting again. Not every day. Not with any purpose. But I left the sketch pad out now, brushes in a jar beside it, as if waiting for me to return. Some days I did. Some I didn't. But it was there, and so was I. My husband noticed. He said the kitchen smelled like old wood and paint. He smiled when he said it. I smiled back. We didn't talk about the trip again. We didn't need to. The moment had passed, and yet it hadn't. It lived quietly inside me, like a photo tucked in a drawer, not discarded, not displayed. One morning, I woke early and stood by the window, watching the world emerge from darkness. The garden was overgrown again. The light soft. The day unremarkable. And I felt, strangely, at peace. Not because I had answers. But because I had made a choice. Not between 2 people. Not between right and wrong. But between being asleep and being awake in my own life. I stepped away from the window, poured a cup of coffee, and picked up my sketch pad. And I began again. The end. All 10 parts